Welcome to Timeless Love Stories. Tonight's story is an original romantic tale set in colonial America. If you enjoy slow-burn romance, deep emotion, and love stories shaped by history, consider subscribing to the channel. Now, let us begin. Leary had imagined arrival as a single, decisive moment, land in sight, ropes thrown, names called across noise and salt, and then the tidy relief of being claimed by the arrangement that had carried her over the ocean. She had rehearsed the posture she would wear on the wharf, the composure that would make gratitude indistinguishable from dignity. She had even prepared a small smile for a man she did not know, as if civility alone could bridge the strangeness of a life transported. Philadelphia did not grant her that moment. The harbor was busy in a way that felt less like welcome than like indifference in motion. Men lifted crates with shoulders braced and curses half-swallowed. Women called to one another, skirts gathered against puddles and refuse. Dockhands ran with coils of rope as though the world depended on speed. The smell was not only sea, it was tar, wet wood, stale grain, river mud. A city breathed just beyond the noise, and it did not pause for arrivals. Leary stood where she had been told to stand. She held his last letter between finger and thumb until the paper softened, and then she folded it away with a care that served no purpose except to keep her hands from trembling. He was meant to be there. Her family had spoken of him in the language reserved for solutions. A man of respectable standing, in good health, established enough to take a wife without delay. There had been no talk of tenderness. There had, however, been certainty. A marriage arranged across an ocean required certainty, or else it required the kind of faith that Leary had never been taught to practice. She waited with her bonnet shadowing her eyes, listening for her own name in the manner she listened for danger, quietly, repeatedly, refusing to let hope rise high enough to shame her. Now and then a sailor glanced her way, perhaps noticing that she was too still. Once, a boy offered to carry her chest for a coin. Leary thanked him and declined, because accepting would have made her situation visible, and visibility felt like the beginning of collapse. Hours slid by and the light shifted, turning the river a dull metal. She watched other reunions assemble and disperse. She watched women lean into embraces with familiarity that almost seemed careless. She watched a man lift a child, swing him once, and set him down again with a laugh, as if the world offered room for such ease. Leary's stomach tightened with hunger, then loosened again into a numbness that felt like control. She told herself that delays happened. She told herself that the ship's arrival time might have been misjudged. She told herself that he might be held at a meeting, or at his work, or by illness, and that there would be an apology later, measured and adequate. It was only when the dock began to empty, when the frenzy reduced to a few lingering laborers and the air cooled enough to make her breath visible, that she admitted the possibility she had kept at bay. He was not coming. The thought did not arrive as drama. It settled with the weight of fact, and with it came a kind of practical fear that had nothing to do with romance. Leary was 23 years old, alone in a colony she had never seen, with only a name and a promise that had failed to translate into a human presence. She could feel the eyes that had not yet settled on her begin to do so, not with malice, but with the small interest that attaches to the unplaced. Night, in Philadelphia, did not have the soft dark of the Scottish countryside. Here it carried voices, late carts, the occasional shout, the uneasy music of a city that slept lightly. Leary found a cheap tavern with a front room that smelled of damp wool and old stew. The woman at the bar looked her over, then named a price that rose halfway through the sentence. Leary paid because she had no language for refusal that would not betray her. The room she was shown to was narrow and cold, with a mattress that sagged and a window that admitted draught in thin, constant threads. She sat on the bed without removing her shoes. She stared at her gloves folded in her lap. She locked the door against the danger with a chair and she waited for panic to arrive, as if it were a visitor that might yet knock. It did not. What arrived instead was anger. So clean it almost felt like clarity. Not towards the man, she did not know him well enough for that, but towards the shape of the world that had made her depend on his punctuality as though punctuality were a virtue owed to women. Towards the letters that had described him in confident lines and never once admitted the chance of refusal. Towards the family home she had left with all its fading gentility, the rooms that had been too quiet, too watchful, as if the very walls had expected her to solve herself by disappearing into marriage. Leary rose before dawn. She washed her face in cold water until her skin stung. She put on her bonnet and tied it with fingers that no longer shook. She ate a piece of bread she had purchased the day before and swallowed it without taste. There was, she reminded herself, one person in the colony whose name did not feel like paper. Alistair. He was not her friend in the way girls spoke of friends. He was a boy she had once known by proximity, by the accident of families with intersecting paths. She remembered him as a lanky child with a quick grin and hands always in motion, a boy who had been given too much freedom for his own good and seemed to treat every rule as something to be tested. She remembered the sound of his laughter more than his face. She remembered that her brother had liked him. In recent years, he had become a presence only through ink. Not through letters to her, those would have been improper, and Leary had never invited impropriety, but through the steady correspondence between him and her brother, which her brother read aloud on winter evenings as if Alistair's words were a kind of entertainment. Leary had sat by the fire and listened, pretending indifference while the cadence of a familiar mind reached across distance. Alistair had gone to the colonies years earlier. He had made his way with the restless confidence of a man who trusted movement more than stability. He had written of work and weather, of land and law, of small humiliations and strange pleasures. He had never written sentiment. Yet his letters always carried something she recognized, a refusal to be impressed by authority, and a humor that made even hardship sound interesting. If anyone could keep her from being swallowed by this city, it would be the person she knew by a thread of memory and a thicker strand of shared language. Leary asked directions with calm precision. She walked through streets that shifted from busy to poor with alarming speed. She followed the smell of bread to a baker and bought another small loaf, not because she needed it but because carrying food felt like carrying control. By midday she found him. Not in the genteel neighborhood she had imagined for a Scottish acquaintance, but near the edge of commercial activity, where wagons were loaded and unloaded and men argued over shipments. He stood by a cart with two other men, his posture relaxed in a way that made the space around him feel less hurried. He was broader than the boy she remembered, and his hair, once the color of straw in her memory, was darker now, sun-touched at the edges. His coat was worn but clean, his boots practical, his hands marked by work. He looked up as she approached, and the moment his gaze settled on her, his expression shifted, first surprise, then calculation, then something that softened into recognition. "Leary MacKenna," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a fact he could rely on. "You're meant to be in Scotland." "I was," she replied. "A few weeks ago." He took a step closer, not crowding her, but reducing the distance in a way that felt protective without being possessive. His eyes swept her quickly, her travel-stained hem, her pale face, the slight tightness at her mouth that betrayed more than her voice did. "You've no escort," he observed. "No," Leary said. He did not appear. Alistair's jaw tightened. He did not ask which he. The answer was too obvious, and politeness would have made it worse. "How long have you been in the city?" "Since yesterday morning." "And where have you been sleeping?" Leary hesitated, not out of shame. She refused to grant shame power over her, but out of caution. Admitting vulnerability to a man she barely knew as an adult felt like placing herself in his hands. Alistair did not press. He waited with a stillness that suggested he had learned patience in the years since boyhood. "A lodging somewhere," she said at last. I can pay for another night if necessary. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, the kind that belonged to him rather than to her situation. It shouldn't be necessary, he said. Then, as if remembering something important, he glanced back at the cart and the men beside it. I am leaving this afternoon. For where? Leary asked, though she already suspected. North Carolina, he replied. The backcountry. I've secured a land grant. Not much in the way of comfort, but it's mine. Or will be, once I've paid the last of the fees and put a roof over my own head. He watched her as he spoke, gauging whether his words would make her recoil. Many women, she knew, would have heard only the absence of refinement. Leary heard freedom, though she did not say so. Alistair's gaze narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with thought. He was deciding something. What do you intend to do, he asked, if the man never turns up? Leary's throat tightened. The future, in all its crude options, rose in her mind: write to her family and beg funds for return, find work in a city that swallowed women without apology, attach herself to some household as a servant, accept charity and lose herself to gratitude. I intend, she said carefully, not to be stranded. Alistair's mouth quirked, and for a moment she saw the boy again, the one who found humor in stubbornness. There's a solution, he said. It's not a fine one, but it's workable. Leary held his gaze. Say it. He gestured towards a quieter corner, away from the men who would listen. He led her a few steps aside, then stopped, turning fully towards her. I'm leaving today, he repeated. The trail south is no place for a woman, but Philadelphia is no place for a woman alone either, if we're being honest. Leary did not argue. Honesty, in this, was a thin mercy. I can take you with me, Alistair continued. But only if you're mine to take. Leary's pulse moved, slow and heavy. What do you mean? She asked, though she understood. His voice remained steady. Marriage. A lawful one. Quick, plain, witnessed. Then we go. You'd have a name attached to you and a reason to move. I'd have a wife to keep tongues from wagging about why I brought a young woman along the Great Wagon Road. Leary stared at him. The audacity of it might have felt insulting if it had not been so bluntly practical. You and I, he confirmed. Leary had expected choices in the colonies, but not this one, not offered with such matter-of-fact certainty. She searched his face for something that would make the decision easier: pity, desire, ambition. She found none of those clearly. What she found was resolve, and something quieter, an unwillingness to let her be harmed if he could prevent it. He was not proposing romance. He was offering shelter with a legal shape. Leary's mind moved in quick, ordered lines. She thought of returning to Scotland, the humiliation, the questions, the small cruelty of concern. She thought of staying in Philadelphia, the risk, the vulnerability, the slow erosion of dignity. She thought of the unknown man who had failed to appear, perhaps dead, perhaps indifferent, perhaps cowardly, perhaps never real at all. Alistair was real. He stood before her with dust on his boots and an answer to her immediate danger. Why would you do this? She asked. His eyes held hers. Because your brother would break my jaw if he learned I'd let you end up in a ditch while I stood in the same city. Leary's lips twitched despite herself, and that small involuntary reaction surprised her. It felt like a door opening in a room that had been closed too long. And if my brother never learns, she pressed. Alistair's expression softened, just slightly. Then I'll still have to live with myself. Leary inhaled slowly. She could feel fear at the edges of her composure, but she could also feel something else. The pull of movement, of leaving uncertainty behind, of choosing a path rather than being pushed along one. What would you expect of me? She asked. His gaze dropped, briefly, to her hands, then returned to her face with deliberate respect. "Nothing you don't agree to," he said. "We'll share a roof, when we have one, because we must. Beyond that, we'll figure it out by degrees. I'm not interested in taking what isn't freely given." Realized how much she needed that sentence until it was spoken. She looked past him at the bustle of the city. The noise suddenly felt like pressure. "I have no better option," she said. Alistair nodded. "Then we do it quickly." They married in a small Swedish Lutheran church on the edge of the city, because it was one of the few places where a stranger could still be received with a minimum of spectacle. The interior smelled faintly of old wood and beeswax, and the light fell through narrow panes as if it had learned restraint. A minister with tired eyes asked the necessary questions without embellishment, then recorded their names in a worn register with a hand that had done the same for years. Two men waiting near the door signed as witnesses, not out of intimacy, but out of habit and a few coins promised for their trouble. Alistair's hand was steady when he took hers. Leary's voice did not shake when she spoke her assent. The vows were brief. The world did not pause. Yet when it was done and they stepped back into the street with new legal gravity attached to them, Leary felt something shift inside her, less like romance and more like the sudden closing of a door behind her. Whatever came next, she would meet it under her own name and by her own choice, even if that choice had been forced into being by circumstances. Alistair insisted on retrieving her chest himself. He moved through the lodging with an efficiency that left no room for questions, paid the woman at the bar without haggling, and lifted Leary's belongings as if they weighed nothing. Leary followed, her new status, wife, sitting on her shoulders like a cloak both foreign and oddly stabilizing. They left Philadelphia that afternoon in a small caravan of travelers heading south and west. The road out of the city did not immediately become wilderness. It became fields, then scattered farms, then the long, patient stretches where trees pressed close and the sky narrowed. Leary sat on a wagon bench with her skirts tucked and her bonnet tied, watching the landscape shift with a vigilance that was half awe and half calculation. Alistair drove the wagon, their proximity unchanging as the miles accumulated. "You're quiet," he observed near dusk. "I'm thinking," Leary replied. "That sounds dangerous," he said solemnly. Leary glanced at him. "Is it meant to be amusing?" "It's meant to distract you," Alistair said. "From the fact that you've been awake too long and eaten too little." "I ate bread," she said. "That doesn't count," he replied. "Bread is what you eat when you've given up hope of pleasure." Leary felt a small laugh threaten. She pressed it down out of habit, then allowed it out anyway, just a breath of sound. Alistair's grin appeared quickly, as if he had been waiting for it. "There," he said. "You're still yourself." Leary looked ahead again. The road stretched, uneven and rutted. The wagon wheels creaked with each turn. The air smelled of earth and crushed leaves, not of sea. She had thought she would feel loss at leaving the city behind, loss of possibility, loss of resources, loss of connection to anything familiar. Instead, she felt an odd loosening, as if distance itself could be a kind of protection. That first night, the caravan stopped near a stand of trees beside a shallow stream. Fires were built in small circles. People spoke softly as they ate. Leary sat on a folded blanket with a tin cup of broth in her hands, the warmth seeping into her fingers. She watched Alistair talk with a man about the trail, his gestures economical, his voice low enough to keep private. When he returned, he crouched beside her rather than towering, and that choice, small, physical, caught her attention more than any words could have. "We'll keep to the Great Wagon Road," he said. "It's the safest path, as safe as any can be. We'll go through Lancaster, perhaps down past the Shenandoah. Then we cut further south." Leary nodded. "How long?" Alistair made a face. Depends on weather, tempers, injuries, and the willingness of mules to be reasonable creatures. That last sounds improbable, Leary said. Entirely, he agreed. She watched him for a moment. Firelight sharpened his features, turning the planes of his face more defined than in daylight. He looked tired, but not uncertain. Leary realized with a jolt that she had married a man whose confidence was not loud. It sat under his skin like something learned through repeated necessity. You don't seem troubled, she said carefully. Alistair's brows lifted. By what? By, Leary searched for language that would not feel melodramatic. By being married to a stranger. His gaze held hers without flinching. We're not strangers, he said. Not entirely. Leary's throat tightened at the quiet certainty of it. We knew each other as children, she said. That is not the same. No, he agreed. But it's a start. And you've been listening to my letters all these years. Leary froze. You knew? Alistair's expression turned wry. I know your brother. He can't keep an interesting thought to himself, especially if it might make him sound clever for having a friend who wrote it. He told me you were often in the room. Leary's face warmed, not with embarrassment exactly, but with the sensation of being seen in a way she had not consented to. And what did he tell you about me? She asked, cautious. Alistair's gaze drifted to the fire for a moment, as if considering. That you read too much for your own peace of mind, he said. That you never laugh unless you mean it. That you can stare down a room full of people without raising your voice. Leary held her cup tighter. Those were not flattering descriptions in her family's eyes. Yet Alistair spoke them as if they were virtues. And what did you think? She asked. I thought, he said slowly, that you must be lonely. The sentence struck her with surprising force. Not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate, and accuracy in another person felt intimate. Leary looked away. She did not trust her voice. She did not want gratitude to become a habit between them, because habits formed quickly in such conditions, and she refused to be indebted in her own marriage. When she spoke, she chose a safer truth. I am tired. Alistair nodded. Then sleep. He set up a small shelter with a tarp and poles borrowed from the wagon. He did it quickly, with the competence of someone who had slept outdoors more nights than in beds. He placed a blanket on the ground and another over it, creating a thin barrier against cold earth. Then, without fuss, he arranged their space so that it was separate enough to preserve decency without making Leary feel abandoned. I'll sleep there, he said, pointing to a spot a short distance away. Close enough to hear trouble, far enough to let you breathe. Leary hesitated, then said, Thank you. Alistair's mouth tightened, as if he disliked the weight of thanks. Don't, he said lightly. If you start thanking me, I'll have to start behaving as if I deserve it, and that's too much work. Leary's lips twitched again. She lay down fully clothed, boots still on, bonnet removed but hair pinned. She stared at the dark canopy above, listening to the sounds of the camp, murmured voices, shifting feet, the occasional pop of firewood. In Scotland, darkness had felt like retreat. Here it felt like exposure. Yet she was not alone in it. That fact, too, was a kind of shelter. Days on the trail developed their own rhythm. Wake before light, eat quickly, pack, walk or ride, stop, build fire, sleep. The world reduced itself to essentials. Leary found, to her surprise, that she adapted faster than she expected. She had been trained for endurance, if not for comfort. In her family home, endurance had meant swallowing disappointment and maintaining composure. Here it meant keeping pace, keeping her skirt out of mud, learning which berries were safe, learning to wrap her feet to prevent blisters. Alistair watched her quietly, as if waiting for her to complain. When she did not, he began to treat her less like fragile cargo and more like a companion. He taught her how to spot soft ground before the wagon wheel sank. He showed her how to tie a bundle so it would not slip. He explained, without condescension, which trees made better firewood and why. "You are very competent," Leary observed one afternoon when he repaired a strap on the wagon harness with nothing but a knife and a strip of leather. Alistair glanced up. "Are you accusing me of something?" "Of competence," Leary said, deadpan. He snorted. "That's slander." Leary's laugh came more easily now, not because she had become suddenly carefree, but because humor, in such conditions, was a survival tool. Alistair's humor was not cruel. It did not depend on making others small. It depended on noticing absurdity in the world and refusing to let it claim the last word. As they traveled, fragments of childhood surfaced between them, not as nostalgia but as a way to connect their present selves to a shared past. "Do you remember the little loch behind the kirk?" Alistair asked one evening as they sat by a fire, their tin plates balanced on their knees. Leary's eyes lifted. "The one where you tried to build a raft." "Tried?" Alistair looked offended. "It sailed magnificently." "It sank," Leary corrected. "It sank after a heroic voyage of," he paused, as if calculating. 3 feet. Leary's smile was soft, surprised at its own presence. "You blamed the water," she recalled. "As I do to this day," he said. "Water is unreliable." Leary glanced at him. "You moved to a continent across the ocean." Alistair shrugged. "I'm a man of contradictions." Leary found herself offering memories too, small ones she had assumed belonged only to her. The sound of Alistair's voice when he argued with her brother about some trivial point. The way he once returned her dropped ribbon without comment, as if returning it were nothing worth mentioning. The day he dared her to climb a low wall and she refused, then later did it alone, privately, to prove she could. "You climbed it?" Alistair asked, startled when she told him. "I did," Leary said. "I didn't want you to see me fail." His gaze softened. "Did you?" "No," she replied. "But I tore my hem." Alistair's grin returned. "A tragedy." "A costly one," Leary said. "I owe you a new hem," he declared solemnly. "You owe me nothing," Leary replied automatically, then regretted the reflex. It was the language of her upbringing, refusal of debt, refusal of vulnerability. Alistair studied her for a moment. "Perhaps," he said gently, "we can allow each other small debts. Not the kind that bind. The kind that make us human." Leary looked down at her hands, at the small scratches on her knuckles, at the dirt that seemed to live under her nails no matter how often she washed. She had never associated humanity with debt. She had associated it with obligation. Yet the way Alistair spoke made it sound different, lighter, voluntary. As the miles accumulated, Leary began to see Alistair in fuller detail. He was not simply a rescuer. He was a man who noticed things and remembered them. He was quick to anger at injustice, slow to anger at inconvenience. He disliked pomp. He respected skill. He could speak with charm when necessary, but he preferred honesty, even when honesty made him less liked. One afternoon, rain came in sheets, turning the road into a slick brown ribbon. The caravan slowed. People cursed under breath. Leary's cloak soaked through, water seeping down her spine. Her boots filled with wet. Alistair fell into step beside her. "If you keep that expression," he said, "your face will freeze and remain permanently offended by weather." Leary blinked water from her lashes. "I am offended." Alistair's eyes gleamed. "Weather doesn't care." That makes it worse, Leary muttered. He laughed, then reached out without asking and adjusted her cloak collar, pulling it higher around her neck. His touch was brief, practical, yet the sensation lingered oddly, not on her skin but somewhere deeper, where awareness lived. Leary swallowed. She did not want to make meaning from a touch that might have been given to any traveler. Yet she could not ignore that the touch had been given to her. That night, when they found shelter under a rocky overhang, Alistair built a fire that smoked and hissed and refused to cooperate. Leary watched him struggle with it, his patience thinning. She could not resist. "Competence?" she asked softly. Alistair glared at the damp wood. "Betrayal," he said. "The world is conspiring to humble me." Leary reached for a piece of dry bark she had kept under the seat, thinking ahead. She handed it to him without comment. Alistair paused, then took it. "So you do allow small debts?" Leary's mouth tightened. "Don't be insufferable." He smiled, delighted. That sounded like affection. "It was irritation," Leary said firmly. "Close cousins," he replied. They made it to North Carolina as autumn deepened. The air grew sharper. The trees shifted into colors that made Leary ache with their beauty, burnt gold, deep red, brown that held light in it. The landscape changed too, growing wilder, less shaped by fences. Farms became fewer. The spaces between settlements widened. Alistair grew more alert, his posture subtly shifting as if he carried an invisible map of dangers. Leary noticed how his gaze swept tree lines, how he listened to silence for unnatural breaks. She did not ask him to explain, she learned by watching, by adjusting herself to his caution. When they finally reached the area of his land grant, it did not feel like arrival in the romantic sense. It felt like stepping into a space that did not yet belong to anyone: raw earth, scattered trees, a creek that cut through low ground, hills that rolled away into distance. "This is it," Alistair said, standing still as if listening to the land itself. Leary looked around. There was no house. No barn. No neighbor in sight. The emptiness felt vast. Yet she did not feel despair. She felt a strange, tight exhilaration, like the moment before stepping into cold water, when the body knows shock is coming and chooses it anyway. "What do we do first?" she asked. Alistair turned to her. His face was tired, weathered by weeks of travel, but his eyes were bright. "We build," he said simply. They started with a shelter. Not a proper cabin at first, but a rough structure that could keep rain off and smoke out. Alistair felled trees with an axe, his movements practiced. Leary hauled branches, gathered stones, learned to judge which logs were too rotten to use. Her muscles protested in ways they never had in Scotland. Her hands blistered. She wrapped them with strips of cloth and kept going. At night, when their small fire burned and the world beyond it dissolved into darkness, they sat close not out of intimacy but out of necessity. Warmth was a resource. So was company. Leary began to understand the domestic sphere in a new way. In Scotland, a house had been a stage for propriety. Here, a house was survival, every task carried direct consequence. If you did not cut enough wood, you froze. If you did not store food, you starved. If you did not repair a roof, you woke to wet bedding. Responsibility became simple, and in simplicity, Leary found unexpected relief. Alistair worked with steady intensity. He did not complain, but he did sometimes swear when a beam slipped or a joint refused to hold. Leary learned his swears were not dramatic. They were simply punctuation. One evening, as they ate a thin stew made from salted meat and wild onions, Alistair looked at her over the rim of his cup. "I keep forgetting," he said. "Forgetting what?" "That you weren't raised for this," he replied. Leary lifted a brow. Must I fail more visibly to satisfy you? His mouth curved. I should not survive the effort. She huffed a short breath of laughter before she could stop herself. You are doing well, he said then, more quietly. Praise, when it arrived in Leary's life, usually came with conditions. This praise did not. It was offered as observation, not as a reward. She felt her chest tighten. She chose honesty over deflection. It helps, she said, that you treat me as capable. Alistair's gaze held hers. You are capable, he said, as if it were absurd to suggest otherwise. As the cabin took shape, so did their partnership. They learned how to move around each other without constant apology. They learned each other's rhythms, when Leary needed silence to think, when Alistair needed noise to shake off frustration. They learned, too, that humor could diffuse tension before it hardened. When Leary misjudged a swing of the axe and sent it biting into earth rather than wood, Alistair did not scold. He simply said, the ground has been sufficiently punished for its sins, and took the axe from her hands with a smile that made her cheeks warm. When Alistair tried to balance a heavy beam alone and nearly toppled it onto his foot, Leary snapped, You're not indestructible, and then, hearing the sharpness in her own voice, added more quietly, I would prefer you intact. Alistair stared at her as if she had spoken in a new language. I shall endeavor to oblige, he said. See that you do, she replied. His mouth curved slightly. I find it a reasonable request. The land demanded more than shelter. It demanded planting, because winter would come whether they were ready or not. They cleared a small patch for crops. They dug and turned soil with aching backs. Leary learned the feel of earth in her hands, learned how the smell changed when it was ready, learned to recognize the slow satisfaction of rows aligned. They visited a local trading post for supplies and news. The post was crude, a cluster of buildings, a muddy yard, men with rifles slung over shoulders. Leary felt eyes on her immediately. Women were present too, but fewer, their faces guarded. Alistair stayed close, his body language subtly declaring her under his protection without making a spectacle of it. A trader offered them nails, salt, a small iron pot. Leary listened carefully as Alistair haggled. She learned quickly, everything had a price, and sometimes the price was pride. As they left, Leary asked, Do you enjoy bargaining? Alistair grimaced. I enjoy winning. That is not the same. It is in my mind, he said. Leary's lips twitched. It would be. He glanced at her. Did you just insult me? I observed, Leary replied smoothly. Alistair's grin returned, bright as a flare. Your brother was right. You do watch closely. On the walk back, their shoulders brushed once, accidental. Yet neither moved away quickly. The contact, brief and ordinary, sent an awareness through Leary that had been building for weeks and now refused to be ignored. She had married Alistair out of necessity. She had expected to live beside him with practical respect, perhaps even affection. She had not expected to feel the heat of him in her imagination when he leaned over to lift a log. She had not expected to notice the way his forearms flexed under strain, or the way his voice changed when he spoke quietly near her ear. She had not expected to feel, at night, the pull of his presence like a tide. She was not a girl. Desire was not unknown to her. But it had always been held at a distance, folded into privacy, treated as a weakness that must not be visible. Now it was becoming visible to her, in her own body, in ways she could not dismiss as mere inconvenience. Alistair, too, changed. Not in speech, he remained measured, but in small hesitations. He began to pause before touching her shoulder to guide her aside. He began to look away a fraction longer than necessary when she washed at the creek and her sleeves slipped up her arms. He began, at night, to place himself just slightly further than warmth required, as if distance were a discipline he imposed to keep something contained. Leary noticed all of it. She did not speak of it. Speaking would have turned tension into demand, and she did not want demand. She wanted choice. One afternoon, the air warmed unexpectedly, a small gift of late autumn sun. Leary suggested they wash properly at the creek, not merely hands and face. The cabin smelled of smoke and sweat and damp wool. Cleanliness felt like a luxury. Alistair looked at the sky, then at her, and said, "If we do, you'll complain about the water." "Of course," Leary replied. "It is water." He smiled. Still unreliable. They walked to the creek carrying soap and cloth. The water ran clear over stones, cold enough to sting. Leary rolled up her sleeves and stepped in carefully, gasping at the shock. Alistair watched her with amusement. "See," she accused. "Unreliable." "It's consistently cruel," he corrected. They washed in awkward stages, turning away from each other at first, maintaining decency. Leary scrubbed her arms and neck, letting the cold bite wake her fully. When she wrung out her cloth, water splashed onto Alistair's boots. He glanced down, then up. A deliberate attack? Leary's eyes narrowed. "An accident." "Accidents seem to find me when you're nearby," he said. Leary's mouth curved. "Perhaps you attract them." "Or perhaps you're plotting," he replied. Something playful rose between them, light as breath. Leary flicked water at him again, this time less defensible. Alistair's eyebrows lifted. "So that's how it is." He scooped water in both hands and threw it at her, not hard, but enough to soak her bodice. Leary squeaked, a sound she would have been horrified to make in Scotland, and then, to her own surprise, she laughed. Alistair's sweeping grin widened as if her laughter were the true prize. They splashed like children for several minutes, the cold forgotten in the heat of movement. Leary's hair came loose at the edges, damp tendrils clinging to her temples. Alistair's shirt stuck to his shoulders. At some point, the play slowed, not because they chose to stop but because something shifted under it. Leary stood still, breathing hard, water dripping from her sleeves. Alistair stood a few feet away, chest rising and falling, his gaze fixed on her face with an intensity that did not belong to humor. The air between them changed. The creek murmured. The sun made the water glitter, indifferent. Leary felt her body become suddenly aware of itself, skin chilled, heart fast, breath visible in small puffs. She became aware of Alistair's hands, now empty, now hanging at his sides as if he did not trust them. She became aware of the line of his jaw, the slight flush on his cheeks, the way his eyes moved from her mouth to her eyes and back, as though caught between impulse and restraint. She should look away, she knew. She should retreat into propriety. But propriety had brought her to a harbor where a man did not appear. Propriety had never saved her. Alistair's voice was low. "Leary." Her name, spoken like that, felt like contact. "Yes," she managed. He took a step forward, then stopped, as if waiting for her to decide whether he could take another. Leary's throat tightened. She could feel fear, but it was not fear of him. It was fear of crossing a line that could not be uncrossed, fear of wanting something that would make her dependent. Then she remembered his words in Philadelphia, "Nothing you don't agree to." She stepped forward instead. Alistair's breath caught. His hand lifted, not rushing, pausing an inch from her cheek as if he would withdraw if she flinched. Leary did not flinch. His fingers touched her jaw lightly, cool from water, then warmed as they rested. The tenderness of it surprised her. She had expected hunger, perhaps. This felt like reverence. Leary's eyes closed without decision. Her mouth tilted up, drawn by a need that had been gathering for weeks like storm. Alistair kissed her. It was not a rough taking. It was firm, unmistakable, and yet held back at the edges, as if he had been waiting long enough to learn restraint and now needed permission to abandon it. Leary responded with a steadiness that surprised her. She placed her hands against his chest, felt the wet cloth, the solid heat beneath. The sensation anchored her. She was not floating. She was choosing. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Alistair rested his forehead against hers for a moment, eyes closed. "I won't," he began, then stopped, as if the rest of the sentence would either bind or frighten her. Leary's voice was quiet. "You may." Alistair's eyes opened, searching hers, reading for hesitation. He found none. "Still," he asked, because he was that kind of man. "Are you certain?" Leary's mouth curved, not with humor now but with something more grounded. "If I wait until I am without doubt, I will die waiting." Alistair made a sound, half laugh, half exhale of surrender, and kissed her again, deeper, more deliberate. They moved from the creek bank to the shelter of trees, where leaves and earth muffled sound. Leary's back pressed against a trunk, rough bark through damp fabric. Alistair's hands framed her face, then slid to her shoulders, then down her arms, as if learning her by touch. Their intimacy unfolded with care rather than haste, with attention to consent that made desire feel safe. Clothing was loosened and shifted rather than torn away. Leary's breath became the loudest thing she had ever heard. The world narrowed to skin, to warmth, to the steady strength of a man who held her as if she mattered more than his own urgency. When their bodies joined together, it was with a sense of inevitability that did not feel like fate imposed, but like a decision at last enacted. Leary felt pain first, sharp and brief, then the slow spreading of warmth, then the astonishing realization that pleasure could be both fierce and gentle at once. Alistair murmured her name against her hair, not as possession, but as acknowledgement. Afterwards, they lay on a blanket under trees, the chill returning in cautious waves. Alistair pulled her close, wrapping his coat around them both. Leary rested her head against his shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Neither spoke immediately. Speech would have made the moment smaller. When Alistair finally did speak, his voice was quiet, almost rough. "I meant what I said in Philadelphia." Leary lifted her head slightly. "About what?" "About not taking what isn't freely given," he replied. Leary's fingers traced the seam of his shirt, slow, thoughtful. "Then we are in agreement," she said. Alistair's arm tightened around her with a tenderness that made Leary's throat ache. They returned to the cabin with damp hair and flushed faces, carrying a secret that was not shameful but sacred. The cabin, small and smoky, felt changed, not because its walls had moved, but because the life within it had shifted. Their marriage was no longer only legal. It was lived. In the days that followed, the tension between them did not vanish, it transformed. It became warmth rather than strain, familiarity rather than restraint. They touched more freely, Alistair's hand at the small of Leary's back as she passed, Leary's fingers on his wrist when she wanted his attention. Their nights became shared, not always physical, but with closeness that made sleep feel less solitary. Leary discovered that intimacy did not have to destroy autonomy. It could, if one allowed it, become another kind of strength. The homestead began to prosper in slow increments. The cabin became tighter, more weatherproof. A small pen was built for future livestock. Crops took hold. Leary, with her sharp mind and disciplined habits, kept careful account of supplies, planned planting, managed storage. Alistair respected her judgment without treating it as novelty. "You run this place like a general," he said one evening as she counted dried beans into jars. Leary glanced up. "Is that praise?" "It's awe," he said, Leary's mouth curved. Awe is excessive. Not if it keeps us alive, he replied. They returned to the trading post more often, each time feeling slightly less like outsiders. Leary learned the faces, the unspoken hierarchies, the way gossip moved faster than carts. She kept her posture composed, her speech measured. Some men watched her with curiosity, some with suspicion. Women assessed her with eyes that had learned, as hers had, to measure safety. It was on one such visit, ordinary, routine, that life lurched into danger. A trapper stood near the post's main building, his clothes rough, his beard untrimmed, his eyes bright with a kind of anger that did not belong to the present moment. Leary noticed him watching Alistair as soon as they entered the yard. She felt, instantly, the tightening of the air, the way a group's attention shifts toward impending conflict. Alistair sensed it too. His posture changed, shoulders squaring slightly. His hand brushed Leary's elbow, a small signal to stay close. The trapper stepped forward. "That's him," the man demanded, pointing. "That's the bastard who robbed me in Wilmington." Leary's blood turned cold. Alistair's voice was even. "I've not been to Wilmington yet." The trapper's eyes narrowed. "You think I forget a face?" Men nearby paused. A few shifted closer, drawn by the possibility of drama. Someone muttered, "What's this?" Another said, "Ain't that Grant's man?" Leary's mind raced. If this turned into a mob, law would come after damage, not before. Alistair held himself still, as if movement would be interpreted as guilt. "You've the wrong man," he said. The trapper's lip curled. Scottish accent, tall, cocky as sin. "Same damn eyes. You stole my purse and my powder, and you left me with nothing." Alistair's jaw tightened. "I didn't." The trapper stepped closer, hands clenched. "Liar." The word struck like a match in dry grass. Men moved. Someone grabbed Alistair's arm. Another seized his coat. Alistair did not fight at first, perhaps knowing fighting would confirm suspicion. But when a fist flew towards his face, he raised his hands, deflecting. The crowd surged at the first sign of resistance. Leary's breath turned shallow. She fought the urge to scream. Screaming would make her a woman in panic. Panic would be dismissed. "Stop," she said loudly, her voice cutting sharper than she expected. "Stop this at once." A few faces turned towards her, startled not by her words but by the authority behind them. Alistair's gaze flicked to her, warning, perhaps, or apology. A man barked, "We'll take him to the courthouse. Let the judge sort it." They dragged Alistair away. Leary followed, heart pounding, boots slipping on mud, but her mind already building a plan. She could not fight men with force. She could fight them with evidence. At the courthouse, a crude building with a front step worn by boots, Alistair was pushed inside. Leary tried to enter with him. A man blocked her, skeptical. "Women don't." "I am his wife," Leary said, voice like iron. "And I will enter." Something in her tone made him hesitate. It was not politeness. It was certainty. He moved aside with a grunt. Inside, the air smelled of sweat and old papers. The judge sat at a desk, looking irritated rather than solemn. The trapper stood with arms crossed, confidence sharp. Several townsmen gathered to watch, hungry for resolution. Leary took in the scene in a quick sweep. This was not a refined court. This was justice shaped by proximity and temper. The judge began. "You there." "Name." "Alistair," he began. "Grant," someone supplied. "Homestead up the creek." The judge rubbed his temple. Do you have witnesses? No, the trapper admitted. He was quick. But I know his face. Leary's mind caught on the weakness immediately. Identification. Memory. Human error. Alistair's voice stayed controlled. I was not in Wilmington on the date you claim. The judge looked unimpressed. And how do you prove that? Leary's heart hammered. She had to act. Yet she had nothing on her, no papers, no witnesses. She could not conjure evidence from air. Then, like a blade of light, the memory arrived, the letters. Her brother's letters. The months of correspondence that had continued even after she left Scotland. Alistair had kept them, she knew. He treasured them not sentimentally, but as a link to a past that had shaped him. They were in the cabin, stored carefully. She had seen them tucked into a wooden box beneath his clothes. Letters carried dates. Letters carried locations. Letters could place a man in Philadelphia when a theft occurred on the Carolinas. Leary's breath steadied. She leaned towards Alistair, her voice low. Hold, she whispered. I can prove it. Alistair's eyes widened slightly. Then he gave a tiny nod. Leary turned back to the judge. Your Honor, she said, using the title as if the room deserved formality even if it did not practice it. I require a brief delay. I can bring documentary proof of my husband's location at the time in question. The judge snorted. Documentary proof? This isn't London. Leary's gaze did not drop. It is still law, she said. And if you wish to be respected as a judge, you will accept evidence. A murmur rippled. The judge's eyes narrowed, irritation flickering into something like caution. He did not enjoy being challenged, but he also did not enjoy appearing foolish. How long? He demanded. Hours, Leary replied. Not days. I will return before nightfall. The judge looked at the crowd, then at the trapper. The trapper's confidence wavered for a fraction. Perhaps he had not anticipated a woman who spoke like this. Fine, the judge grunted. But he stays here. Leary nodded once, then turned and left without another word, because further argument would weaken the authority she had just claimed. She ran. Not like a girl in a story, not with skirts fluttering prettily, but with the blunt determination of someone who knew that the difference between justice and ruin could be measured in minutes. The path back to the homestead was rough, but she knew it now. She moved through trees, across shallow water, up the rise to the cabin, lungs burning. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke and their shared life. Leary went straight to the box. Her fingers shook now, not with fear but with urgency. She opened it, pulled out the thick bundle of letters tied with twine. She sorted fast, scanning dates, ink, any mention of location. There, the month of the alleged theft. There, Alistair's reply, written in Philadelphia, describing the purchase of supplies, the departure date, the weather. There, her brother's letter addressed to Alistair in Philadelphia, dated clearly, just a few days later. Leary did not read sentiment. She read proof. She gathered the relevant letters and shoved them into her bag. Then she ran again. When she returned to the courthouse, breathless and dusty, the room had grown more crowded. People loved a trial. It offered them an illusion of order. Leary pushed through bodies with the single-mindedness of someone used to navigating rooms that did not want her. She stood before the judge, letters in hand. Your Honor, she said, voice carrying. The judge frowned. You again. Yes, Leary replied, and placed the letters on the desk with deliberate care. These are letters sent to and from my husband and my brother, dated and postmarked. They place my husband in Philadelphia during the period of the alleged theft. The judge looked skeptical. Postmarks can be faked. Leary's eyes flashed. By whom? A man building a cabin in the backcountry? For what purpose? A murmur. Some laughter. The judge's mouth tightened. The trapper lunged forward. That proves nothing. He could have been in Wilmington and still got mail. Leary turned to him with controlled fury. Then answer plainly, she said. How certain are you? The trapper hesitated, eyes shifting. Leary pressed, voice still measured. You say you know his face. Yet the coast is full of men with Scottish accents. How much of your certainty comes from anger rather than memory? The trapper's nostrils flared. Leary did not let him regain ground. Look at him now, she said, gesturing to Alistair. He has traveled for weeks. He has been working land. Does he resemble the man who robbed you months ago, in a coastal town, in darkness? The trapper's face reddened. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The judge leaned forward, sensing the shift. Do you withdraw your accusation? He demanded. The trapper's confidence cracked. I'm not sure, he said, voice rough. I thought I was sure, but... The room murmured more loudly now, disappointment mixing with judgment. People disliked uncertainty. It made them question their own instincts. The judge slapped a hand on the desk. That's enough. If you cannot identify him with certainty, there's no case. Release him. A pause. Then the men holding Alistair stepped back. Alistair straightened slowly, shoulders rolling as if shaking off invisible chains. His eyes went to Leary, and in them was something that made her breath catch, gratitude, admiration, and a fierce affection that did not hide. Outside, the late afternoon light slanted across the yard. People spilled out, eager to retell the drama. Leary stood on the courthouse step, the letters still clutched in her hand like a weapon she had used well. Alistair came beside her. He did not touch her immediately. He looked at her as if he were seeing her anew, not as a woman he had married out of necessity, but as someone who had chosen him in the only way that mattered, by standing publicly in his defense. Leary's throat tightened. She had been composed inside. Now, with danger receding, she felt the tremor beneath that composure. Alistair turned to the crowd. Listen, he said loudly. The conversation slowed. Heads turned. Even the judge, lingering near the door, paused. Alistair's voice carried, clear and unapologetic. This woman, he gestured to Leary, crossed an ocean and was left standing alone on a dock like she was nothing. She found me when she could have broken. She walked the trail and built a home with her hands. And today she did what every man here ought to respect. She brought truth into a room full of noise. Leary's face warmed, but she did not look away. Alistair's eyes swept the gathered people, then returned to her. I love her, he said simply, the words falling into the space with the weight of fact. Not for what she did for me, though I'll never forget it, but for who she is. She is my wife by law, and by choice, and I'll not have anyone in this town forget either. The silence that followed was dense. Some men looked uncomfortable. Some looked impressed. A few women stared at Leary with something like wonder. Leary's pulse hammered. Public declarations were not her language. Yet something in her, something that had been built over months of labor, humor, intimacy, and shared risk, rose to meet his words. She stepped closer to Alistair, close enough that their sleeves brushed, and said quietly, for him alone, you are making me visible. Alistair glanced down at her, eyes softening. You've been visible to me for months, he murmured. I'm only correcting the world. Leary exhaled shakily, then allowed herself, for once, to accept being seen. They returned to the homestead with dusk gathering. The cabin greeted them with its familiar smoke-scented air. Leary set the letters back in the box carefully, fingers reverent now. Evidence and memory together. She closed the lid as if sealing something sacred. That night, Alistair held her as they lay under blankets, the wind pressing against the cabin walls. Leary listened to the steadiness of his breathing and felt, with a clarity that surprised her, how deeply she had bound herself to him, not as rescue, not as convenience, but as chosen life. I was frightened, she admitted into the dark. Alistair's arm tightened. I know. Leary swallowed. Not of them. Of losing you. Alistair was silent for a moment, then said softly, You won't lose me easily. You'll have to get rid of me deliberately, and I doubt you've the patience. Leary's laugh was quiet, wet with emotion. You're insufferable. And you adore me, he replied. Leary turned her face into his shoulder. Don't be absurd. His kiss touched her hair. It's too late, he murmured. I've already decided you're mine. Leary's voice was calm, the calm of acceptance rather than surrender. I am mine, she corrected. And I choose you. Winter came, harsh but survivable. They stored food, cut wood, learned to read the sky. Leary's hands grew stronger. Alistair's cabin-building skills improved. They argued sometimes, about priorities, about risk, about whether Alistair's jokes were occasionally unbearable. They made up quickly, because life was too practical for prolonged resentment. Spring returned with mud and new shoots. Their crops grew. They expanded. They built a second room. Then, in time, a proper house began to rise, larger, sturdier, with a hearth that held warmth more generously. Children came, too, not as an abstract future but as real bodies and cries and small hands grasping at Leary's fingers. Leary discovered a kind of love that did not erase her selfhood but widened it. Alistair became a father with awkward tenderness, pretending competence while learning daily. They prospered, not in the dramatic sense of fortune, but in the quiet accumulation of stability, stores filled, roofs secure, land increasingly shaped by their effort. People at the trading post began to speak of them with respect. Leary's composure, once a defensive tool, became leadership. Alistair's humor, once a shield, became a form of welcome. Sometimes, in the evenings, when the house was quiet and the children slept, Leary and Alistair sat on the porch steps with a cup of cider between them, watching fireflies rise and fall like slow sparks. On one such night, Leary said, almost idly, "Do you ever wonder what became of him?" Alistair's brow lifted. The phantom fiancé? Leary's mouth curved. Yes. Alistair leaned back against the porch post. I wonder occasionally if he fell into the river, he said thoughtfully. It would be an appropriately humiliating end for a man who fails to show up to his own future. Leary snorted softly. That's uncharitable. It's imaginative, he corrected. Leary's gaze drifted to the dark line of trees. If he had appeared, she said quietly, my life would have been different. Alistair's voice was gentle. Worse? Leary considered, and then answered with a certainty that felt earned. Smaller. Alistair's hand found hers, fingers threading together. Then we owe him something, he said. Leary glanced at him, amused. Gratitude? Alistair's eyes gleamed. A silent prayer of thanks. And perhaps the hope that he continues to disappoint women elsewhere, so they might find better men. Leary laughed, then squeezed his hand. You are terrible. Alistair kissed her knuckles. And you love me. Leary looked at the homestead, at the house they had built, at the fields that held life because they had chosen to make it so. She thought of the dock in Philadelphia, the cold night, the fear she had swallowed. She thought of the road, the fires, the creek, the courthouse, the moment she had stepped into a room of men and brought truth with trembling hands. Love, she understood now, had not arrived like a rescue ship. It had arrived as partnership, as labor shared, as humor offered when pride might have hardened, as choice made again and again in small moments until the accumulation became destiny. Leary rested her head briefly against Alistair's shoulder. In the quiet, she allowed herself one thought that felt almost like superstition and yet, to her, rang true. Some lives were not shaped by the plans made for them, but by the failures of those plans, by the empty space where an expected man did not appear, leaving room for a different kind of meeting. And for that empty space, she was, without bitterness, quietly grateful. Thank you for listening to this story. If it stayed with you, you are warmly invited to like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. New timeless love stories await you. Until next time.